Welcome everyone to CG seminar and webinar number 378. And we have with us today Tsai, and he's going to talk to us about differential peer effects of international roommates on college outcomes, evidence from students of disadvantaged backgrounds. And before I introduce our presenter, let me take you through the webinar protocols. I'll now share my screen. Here we are. Remember that the webinar is being recorded, and we trust that you'll take the opportunity to see it again on YouTube, on our YouTube channel when it's posted there. Should be in the next few days. During the webinar, we advise you to stay muted. Extraneous noise can intervene with and spoil the webinar. You can also leave your camera off too, although it doesn't matter so much about the camera. But we don't need to see you during the presentation until we get to the Q&A. And then, of course, when we bring you into a Q&A question or statement, we'd like you to turn your camera and your microphone on at that point. We advise you to use speaker view in the top right-hand corner there, so you can see who's speaking at any point during the discussion. Now, the presentation will run for half an hour or so, and then after that we have Q&A, and that's an important part of the webinar. We really welcome your participation. If you want to ask a question or make a statement about the presentation, indicate your intention in the chat, and I will select people from the chat into the Q&A part of the webinar. When you're asked to speak, turn on your mic, most important, turn on your camera if you can, and then tell us who you are and where you are from, and then make your statement or ask your question. So at this point, it's a pleasure to introduce our presenter. Hsin-Ta Tsai is a joint doctoral student, PhD student in public policy between Georgia Institute of Technology and Georgia State University. And his research interests include studying the impacts of social and economic policies on marginalized communities in the United States and globally, such as people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and the LGBTQ plus community. And that, in those specializations, I think that our presenter has a lot in common with many of us who take part in this webinar program. So we look forward to a good discussion. At this point, Hsin-Ta, let me hand over to you. We can see that. You might be muted. We're not hearing anything. We've got no sound.
How about now? Can you hear me?
That's good. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, Professor Martinson. And sincere thanks to the faculty and staff at CGHE for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here. Warm welcome to everyone who's joining either live with us now or watching the recorded seminar on YouTube. In this session today, I'll be sharing our working paper titled Diversity and Inclusion Through Rooming Assignments, Differential Peer Effects of International Roommates on College Outcomes. We changed the title slightly to reflect the diversity and inclusion elements of our paper a little bit more explicitly. Before I start, I'd like to briefly introduce the author of this working paper, the co-author of this working paper, Dr. Eos Trinidad. Dr. Trinidad is an assistant professor of education policy at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to collaborate together on this project. So this paper is still a work in progress, and I would appreciate any feedback you may have or question that you may have to help us strengthen the manuscript. Please feel free to reach out to me with any follow-up questions via either of the institutional emails on the screen. I'm a joint student, so using either of the institutional emails will be able to reach me. All right, so let's go right into it. So our paper looks at peer effects in higher education research. Broadly defined, peer effects are the causal effects of peers' behaviors on one's own behavior, or in the field of education, how the behaviors of your schoolmates, classmates, and roommates that may impact your own actions and outcomes in a school setting. So why peer effects, and why do we care so much about peer effects? Well, peer effects are an important educational input like teacher quality, classroom size, and school resources like school finance that shape student outcomes. Understanding the
I'm sorry
relative,
to interrupt you. We're not seeing
right?
any slides.
Oh, you're not seeing any
We've
slides.
got no slides showing, so you'll need to screen share.
Okay, thank you so much for reminding me of that. Okay, can
We can now
you
see that. Yeah.
see something? Right. All
Yeah.
right, that makes sense. Thank you. So understanding the relative impact of peer effects versus other inputs in the education production function would have major implications for education policy making and practice. But existing research really shows mixed and contradictory evidence on the direction and magnitude of peer effects. This is further complicated by the methodological challenges to make causal estimates, in particular, the endogenous self-selection bias that makes it very difficult to isolate the causal peer influence using just observational data. We've also seen in past studies showing how the particular student group composition or the context of the schools being studied would then influence the outcome measure. So to give some examples to get the points across, I will highlight some key studies using institutional data to measure peer effects. And in the interest of time, I will only focus on academic outcomes from past research. So research done at, for example, Dartmouth College, Williams College, and this one at Air Force Academy shows positive influence of peer effects as reflected in college GPAs or grades in the United States context. We call it GPAs, grade point averages. One study, one additional study in 2008 found male students with roommates who had a history of drinking before college experienced a negative impact on their GPA compared to the male students with non-drinking roommates. School name is kept confidential due to data access agreement, but we do know this is a large state university in the United States. Other studies using institutional data from, for example, the University of Maryland, Wellesley, and West Point saw little evidence of peer effects on academic performance. The study done at Wellesley College especially concluded that the roommate peer effects are not a key determinant of students' average academic outcomes. So taken together, these existing research just really shows mixed and contradictory evidence on the direction and magnitude of peer effects. Additionally, we also know that most of the work really focused on short-term outcomes when measuring academic performance, such as grades at the end of the first semester, first term, or the first year. In light of these past research findings, we designed this particular study using quasi-experimental methods to mitigate the endogeneity concern, which would allow us to attempt causal inference. Our data also allows us to measure short and long-term college outcomes in a unique college setting with students primarily from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. This is in contrast to most other higher education peer effect studies designed based on elite schools, the ones that we talked about, Dartmouth College, Wellesley College, and Williams College, or very elite schools in the United States. A core aspect of this study is its assessment of the impact of intercultural roommate pairing on a variety of college outcomes, that is, international students and domestic students as roommate pairs. This is motivated by the contemporary emphasis on enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. This is especially true after seeing evidence showing benefits of increased campus diversity. However, relatively little is known about how intergroup contact, as manifested in being cross-cultural college roommate pairs, can have implications for students' college outcomes. In our paper, we define international students as non-immigrant students on a student visa, and domestic students as immigrant permanent residents of the United States or full citizens of the United States. So those are the two group of students we're working with. The institutional context is Berea College. So our data comes from Berea College. Berea College is a national liberal arts college. It has a total population of about 15 to 1600, depending on the year. Of the population, per year, the college accepts around 20 to 35 international students. That's excluding the COVID years. They have a separate policy of typically not accepting more than one candidate per country, per admission cycle, to really diversify their international student body. So Berea College is unique in that it was the first interracial and coeducational college in the South of the United States. It was the first, starting in 1855, to welcome everybody to go to campus for free. But uniquely, it accepts only students with limited means. To put that in context, about 98% of the domestic students in Berea College are Pell Grant recipients. And if you don't know what Pell Grants are for our international audience, Pell Grants are a federal need-based standard showing that students do show exceptional financial needs. The international students accepted to Berea College are also screened based on their financial needs using their international standard. Berea College is also located in rural Appalachia, which according to decades of research is one of the poorest regions in the United States. So a college serving primarily low-income students in a poor region, that's the context we're working with and the subgroup of students we're looking at. So the institutional background that motivates us to look at the international and domestic peer influence is that according to the internal data from Berea, we can see its international students have consistently outperformed their domestic peers in terms of, for example, first to second year retention rate. These are publicly available data through Berea's website. So we can see the orange bars, they represent the international students, and the rest of the colors are the rest of the domestic peers. You can see the orange bars consistently outperform the rest of the other domestic peers. That gap you see right there is especially more telling if we focus on 6-year graduation rate. You can see the orange bars being really high up there. So these notable differences prompts a compelling investigation into the potential either negative or positive influence between international students at Berea and their domestic peers. So formally, we ask if domestic and international roommate pairing, this mechanism, during freshman year or the first year in college, affects short and long-term college outcomes. We look at 3 different outcomes or constructs that include academic performance, college persistence, and global outlook. Academic performance is captured by GPAs, so the first 4-year GPAs in the student college tenure. College persistence are measured by both multi-year retention rate, so second year, third year, fourth year, how likely they are going to come back to school to continue studying, and the 6-year eventual graduation rates. We use 6 year to also capture students in majors that take more than the regular 4 years to complete, like nursing, for example. We also look at global outlook. This is a rather abstract construct that we're trying to measure. We take advantage of the fact that Berea College students would have to complete 2 required international perspective courses. So we use those 2 international, oh, whoops, I have balloons for some reason. So the international perspective courses at Berea College is our way of capturing an indication, I would say, indication of showing global awareness, of showing global outlook. It's an imperfect proxy, of course, but that's something that we're working with and that's available in the data set. The hypotheses in our paper, we use a diagram or two diagrams to show that. So if you focus on the left side of the diagram, just the domestic student subpopulation, we hypothesize that this intervention or the rooming with international student mechanism for domestic students would have positive effects on, for example, their academic performance, their multi-year retention rate as a persistence measure, and their global outlook measure. These hypotheses are based on past research showing that international students tend to spend more time engaging in academics or education-related purposes, activities, or other engagements on campus, and that would then have positive effects on domestic students. That's the hypothesis. Also, according to past research on interventions, is that we should then observe a fading out effect or diminishing effect, where the initial positive and negative impact eventually will reduce in magnitude, as well as decrease in the statistical and substantive significance. So because of that, we should then see the effect then fade out or diminish later on, which means eventually after 6 years, we will see nothing for graduation, also as a persistence measure. So that's our hypothesis for the domestic students. On the flip side, if you go to the international student diagram, it may be the case that the positive effects on domestic students could come at the expense of international students. Previous work found a negative association between international students on social integration on campus and their college persistence in the US. In an environment with decreased, relatively, I would say, decreased emphasis on academics and increased focus on social activities, international students may reduce their academic efforts. So because of that, we argue reversely that the roommate intervention, rooming with a domestic student, would have negative impact on international students' academic performance and negative impact on their multi-year retention rate as a resistance measure. But since this is an intercultural exposure, we should also see increased global outlook. And then again, eventually after 6 years, we should observe no impact on eventual graduation, it being a distant outcome. So our data comes from Berea College through the IRB approved process. We have data for entering cohorts or first year cohorts from the year 2000 all the way to 2015. Our original data has 71 students. We dropped some observations with empty data entries and some others with entry errors. So our final data set has about 6,600 plus domestic students and 400 plus international students. That's the sample we're working with. Our data set has demographic information, their grades, the students' retention rates, and their graduation information. We don't have a lot of control variables to work with. So other details like their graduation year, and their degree program. So for example, major declaration, we don't have those more detailed info. It's not provided in an attempt to prevent individual student identification, so for confidentiality concerns. So we don't have a lot of control variables to work with. This is a rather limited data set. We first look at comparability between the two group of students we're trying to compare, the students who are in this intervention and the students who are not in this roommate pair intervention. Ideally, the first year roommate assignment is done through a lottery process. This should be the case for most of the universities or colleges in the United States, because during the first year, you don't know anybody. So it's just a random assignment. So this ideal is that we will be in a randomized world and we can just compare the naive estimator of an OLS regression and then call it a day. But we looked into our data. We do observe non-compliance, meaning students did change their roommates despite the intended roommates random assignment. We see that through, for example, the difference in means results in table 1. Our result reveals statistically significant differences between the treated and the control students across most of the demographic characteristics. This basically indicates that we don't have comparable groups. Our control and our treated groups are just not comparable. So we can just estimate a naive estimator and then call it a day. We then thought about using so we're no longer in the randomized world, that idea is out of the way. We then thought about using the lottery results since it was still a lottery process, even though people change their eventual placement. We wanted to get access to the lottery result to use that as an instrumental variable to then strengthen our causal estimation or causal conclusion. That lottery result or record for some reason is not available. I'm not sure if it's just lost in the process or because of change of staff members, they're not able to get a consistent record of the lottery result throughout the years. So because of that, we can't really use instrumental variables approach due to lack of data. So we eventually settled on selection on observables approach. That's eventually what we did. That means we use the inverse probability weighting estimation approach. We report our IPW results as our main findings. So we first did separate analyses for the domestic and international students and then estimated the propensity scores by modeling treatment assignment as a function of all the observed covariates. We don't have a lot of covariates to work with, like I said. We only have, I remember, transfer status, the students' racial ethnicity, their gender, and where they came from. That's it. That's all the covariates that we had access to. So using the IPW selection on observables approach, we estimate both the average treatment effect and the average treatment effect on the treated. The average treatment effect, or ATE, can be thought of as the average effect among everybody, right? So that means if we were to put every first-year college students through this roommate intervention, what would the effect be? That's the ATE. The ATET, on the other hand, focuses on the effect of those who are already treated. So those who are already in the domestic international roommate pair situation, we look at what the effects would be for this subset group of people. The IPW approach constructs the synthetic control groups by reweighting the sample observations using that propensity score that we calculated before. So these would be our counterfactuals, or in other words, these are the observations who would, at least in the covariates world, look closest to me, but have the opposite treatment assignment or status from me. To mitigate model dependence, we compare our IPW results with different model specifications. We use augmented IPW, we use propensity score matching, we use nearest neighbor matching, all in an attempt to make sure that we are not picking up different results for robustness check. We also ensure that all techniques that we use would address missing data by filling in missing potential outcomes while maintaining covariate balance. Okay, now we're in our result findings or result section. If you look at table 2, this is results for domestic students. We can see that the ATE estimates shows if domestic students were to room with international roommates, their average first-year GPA would increase by around 0.14 points. When focusing on the treated students, the ATET estimates, we observed that the average first-year GPA is around 0.15 points higher when all the students who room with international students during their first year continue to do so, compared to that potential outcome of around 2.65 GPA that would have occurred if none of these students had roomed with international students. Furthermore, we said we're gonna see if there's a fading out effect. So the declining magnitude and significance level of these positive estimates on GPA from the second to the fourth year suggest the benefits diminish over time. So we do observe that these effects fade out over time. On the other hand, table 3, for international students, we see no statistically significant effects for international students with domestic student roommates. The ATE estimates across 4 years show no significant difference. The same for ATET. So because of that, we don't pick up any diminishing or fading out because we don't really see anything. Table 4 shows effect for college persistence and or the indication of having global outlook measure for both subgroups. College persistence retention, if we just focused on the domestic student subsample, the ATET estimate indicates a marginally statistically significant increase of 3.8 percentage points in second-year retention rate for the treated students relative to the control of about 80%. This points to a positive impact on persistence odds for domestic students directly exposed to international roommate. However, we don't see the same for average treatment effects, the ATE estimate. That suggests that these benefits may not extend more broadly when the roommate assignment is applied to the overall freshman class. For international or global outlook, the reverse is true. The positive but marginally significant ATE estimate for mean grades in the international perspective courses suggests that the domestic students paired with international roommates do see higher level of global outlook, ex proxy by earning moderately higher IP grades. But a significant, statistically significant effect is not observed when we focus on the treated students. Again, this is an imperfect proxy, so we refer to this as showing indication of having global outlook. Now, if we move to the international student side of the table, neither ATET nor ATE results indicate statistically significant change in the second-year retention, and we also don't see anything for global outlook. So for international students, it's basically we see nothing. One thing that both subgroups have in common, however, according to our hypothesis, is that the eventual graduation, we should see no effect on that eventual graduation. Which is the case for both domestic students and the international student subsample. We don't pick up that effect. Okay. We also do some robustness checks, like I said, using different model specifications to make sure that we can reduce model dependence. We compare our MEN finding, the IPW finding, results to estimates obtained using 3 different alternative approaches. Overall, I'm gonna be, in the interest of time, be skipping all the robustness check tables. Overall, the story is we observe consistent treatment effects across all different models. This suggests the core findings do not seem to be driven solely by one model specifications. The alignment of the results across different models and different approaches with different methodological assumptions provides relatively greater confidence that the estimates reflect true differences arising from the intercultural roommate pairing, rather than any biases associated with any single modeling approach. So we can have greater confidence in the reported effects. If you're lost in the tables, like I sometimes do when I read a lot of different tables, this is a summary in a diagram form using that hypothesis table. Our hypotheses for the domestic students are supported here. We do not see, for example, these relationships. For international students, at least, we don't see any negative influence on their academic performance and their retention rates. So I would say at least no harm done. Okay, so according to past research, we should see some negative influence, but in our data, we don't. So kind of good news. In the discussion and concluding section, I have a couple of slides to talk about key points and implications and limitation of our paper. So this study hopefully provides unique evidence that the assignment of domestic and international students as freshman year roommates will lead to a number of college benefits for domestic students at a college serving primarily economically disadvantaged students. So context matters. So I need to be more explicit, right? While the estimated ATE on GPA of having an international roommate was a modest increase of between 0.09 to 0.14 grade points for domestic students, this seemingly small effect could translate into meaningful impacts for a substantial subset of students. I'm going to use one interpretation from Gelman at Columbia. He says one way to interpret this is if you just multiply these numbers by 10, this is equivalent to a large GPA boost of between 0.9 and 1.4 points. That's out of 4.0. The full GPA is 4.0. So we're looking at 0.9 and 1.4 points out of 4.0 for 10% of our students if the intervention had no effect on the other 90%. So if you look at this interpretation, in particular, the roommate intervention likely substantially benefited some domestic students, even though the overall estimated effect across the population was small. Excuse me. At the same time, while we're not saying we're closing achievement gaps completely, the intentional integration via diverse rooming assignments appears to give domestic students an early boost. This is consistent with prior research, whose findings also showed academic peer effects that persisted at a diminishing rate into later college years. Our findings carry important practical implications for an institution like Berea College and others focused on supporting students from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Intercultural roommate pairing is one avenue for facilitating positive peer influences and accelerated learning. Our findings especially extend past studies such as the one by Dinarski and colleagues in 2021, whose work concluded, and I quote, "A low-cost, low-touch intervention can strongly affect students' application and enrollment at selective colleges." Our work here demonstrated an equally low-cost and low-touch roommate pairing intervention that can effectively boost students' early college outcomes at a selective liberal arts college in the United States. So whereas their work look at enrollment and application to colleges, we look at after enrollment, the first few years in college, the effects, the college outcomes. This intentional mixing of student subgroups is worth considering for higher education administrators and policymakers as an affordable strategy for cultivating an inclusive and educational environment and harnessing demographic diversity for academic gains. But when reading our findings alongside research on culturally engaging campus environments, our results point to the need for a more comprehensive approach to optimize the benefits of intercultural exposure. While rooming with international students provided some early academic boosts for domestic students, these gains diminished over time. This indicates that cultural familiarity and validation from this experience alone was not sufficient to support persistence through college graduation and retention in later years. In addition, we must also develop strategies to ensure meaningful benefits for all students, because we don't see anything for the international student subsample. So further research is still needed to develop comprehensive solutions that will support everybody all throughout college years, all the way to graduation. While we highlight the contributions of our paper, we also know some of its limitations, and this is my final slide. We rely, first of all, entirely on weighting and matching methods to simulate randomization and to attempt causal inference. While these techniques can help minimize selection bias, findings in this paper are not completely causal, given our inability to randomly assign all students, and that selection on observables approach designs rely on a very strong assumption. It is fairly difficult to completely establish the assumption that once we control for the few control variables, the observed covariates that we have, treatment is as good as random or quasi-random. We do, however, achieve balance across the covariates in our estimation models, making it more plausible, I would say, that there would be balance across the unobserved covariates. It's important to know, however, that unobserved differences between the treated and control groups may still confound the results, and we don't have access to that data. Our estimation models also reasonably satisfy the common support or overlap assumption, ensuring that there are both treated and untreated units for each level of the observed covariates. We have only limited access to the complete data set to conduct our analysis. So if you still remember, we only have their race, ethnicity, information, gender, transfer status, and where they came from. So we only have those control variables to work with. So I would say, because of that, our ability to achieve true balance treated and control groups is constrained. So more robust covariate data could really enable better matched samples and strengthen our causal conclusions. Despite these limitations, though, the consistency of results across multiple different model specifications provides some reassurance for at least the direction and significance of our findings. In the future, we do recommend researchers to qualitatively uncover how students conceive of pure effects mechanisms work in this international domestic roommate pairs. So some questions that we came up with, for example, include, why do we see such effects for domestic students, but not for international students? And why only the first few years in college? How exactly do low-income students in the United States experience and perceive value from intercultural engagement on campus? And what forms of support might further empower them to capitalize on diversity? These questions would help capture the students' voice and their perspectives to shed further light on the intercultural peer effects. I think it's just really important to talk to the students to get their interview data. Overall, this study provides preliminary evidence, initial evidence, that diversity and cultural integration initiatives have the potential to support disadvantaged students' learning and success. In our view, this study really paves the way for further research to better understand how to enact such high impact practices in a way that's both more meaningful and more equitable. Okay, I will conclude my presentation now. I will take any questions, comments, or suggestions that you may have. I will attempt to answer your questions. If I don't know, I will tell you I don't know.
Well, thank you, Hsin-Ta. That was very well presented, and in our model study, I think, in terms of method, and people will gain a lot from repeatedly revisiting your presentation on YouTube. And I really like the way you indicated limitations and raised questions about the method at the end, and pointed to ways in which the conclusions could be made more robust. It's very striking, though, isn't it, this asymmetry between the two student populations, with international students not gaining much in terms of, or anything in terms of academic performance and persistence and global outlook, but the domestic students having a discernible positive effect, as you say, perhaps affecting a minority strongly, although the effects on a large number may be negligible. The fact that it's affecting some strongly would itself be sufficient to justify, I think, tentative positive conclusions. But I mean, you must have thought about this asymmetry, and I must say, coming from the UK and Australia, where the international student populations are much larger, that would be much more important in those countries. The fact that international students are not gaining from the integration process is a serious problem, serious weakness, if you like, in the scheme. And it's not just about whether internationalization is good for domestic students. It's also a question of whether internationalization is good for international students as well. Why the difference, you think? Why don't international students gain from the relationship? Is there too much else going on in their lives? I know you don't have a firm causal argument here, but you must have thought about possible explanations.
Yeah, our current research design doesn't really allow us to answer the why question specifically, but yes, I've thought about potential reasons why this might be the case. Well, first of all, there might be some other outcomes we're not measuring. So I'm only looking at, for example, academic performance, GPAs or college persistence in terms of retention rates and graduation. There might be other effects socially, so social integration or other social benefits that we are not seeing that international students might be benefiting when they go to a different country to study in a different country. So that might be some other reasons. Because we're not looking at those outcomes, we're not picking up effects. I would say I was more concerned before I saw the results because our study based on past research, most of them point to the fact that if we look at these indicators or these outcomes, we would see negative influence on international students because of, for example, local United States students being more social and less academic, relatively speaking. So that would have some sort of bad influence, quote unquote, bad influence on the international students based on the outcomes that we're studying. That was a little bit concerning. And at least our results show that no harm is done for the international student subgroup in our particular campus environment. So to answer your question, I guess it's not entirely bad news. We see no negative effects, which is what all the other studies found, which is not what the other studies found because they saw negative effects. And also, there might just be other outcomes we're not looking at that international students are benefiting from.
Well, let's hope so. Because of internationalization, there's a high cost item for international students, and they're not gaining enough from the process of meeting and living with domestic students. That would be a considerable concern.
Right. That's actually an important point to make for this particular school because Berea College only accepts low-income students, and that's the same case for domestic and international students. So international students going to Berea College are not self-funded. Everybody is funded by the college. So because of that financial need that the college established for every single student, no one is paying tuition. So at least in that
what a
regard.
nice environment. Very attractive. The one I've got one more question, then we'll bring in some people from the Q&A. Global outlook, important concept. Can you expand on your understanding expand on the definition that was at play here?
Yes. This is a very abstract concept, I would say. So when we were trying to work with the data that we have, so instead of looking at the traditional measures of GPAs or retention rates, we thought about doing something more creative. And then we remember that Berea College students will have to take this thing called international perspective classes. This is part of their liberal arts curriculum. So everybody would have to take some classes that speak to international perspective. And the college especially require all the students to have a non-Western perspective and a Western perspective. So you can really balance that East-West or Western, non-Western cultural exposure balance. So because of that, we thought we have access to that. We can probably capture something that says a little bit about global outlook. So it is an imperfect proxy, but it's our attempt to capture a different dimension of global awareness, global values, global outlook. Yeah.
Now let's go to our participants. And the first question is from Agung Nugroho. Good to see your name in the chat, Agung, and please give us your question.
Thank you, Hsin-Ta, for great presentation, and thank you, Simon, for raising my name as the first questioner. First of all, I would like to say that's a brilliant research by Tsai. Basically, like it's really can be a crucial additional knowledge related to the relationship between international students and domestic students, which I think also can be very crucial reflection for universities around the world when they try to recruit as many international students as possible, but sometimes they can't actually provide meaningful learning for them in terms of intercultural competence. Like in one of your findings, you mentioned that there is a slight increase in students' GPA because of the relationship between international students and domestic students. I was just wondering if that increase merely because of the interaction between international students and domestic students, or did you also consider other factors influencing the slight increase of the students, especially domestic, I would say, increasing their GPA level?
So thank you for your question. So we use our particular approach to really try to isolate that pure influence causal effects. So we try to say that because of this intervention, the international/domestic roommate pair, that would affect these outcomes that we're looking at. So that's statistically how we're trying to measure that. So we control for the things that we can control. So we would say, yes, we pick up some positive effect for the domestic student sample. That would say something about a stronger association between this roommate intervention and the outcome that we're looking at. So it is a stronger association, not necessarily a causal claim. It is a complement, I would say, on top of all the things that are going on in the student's life. So the better education quality of this college or the wider environment of this college, on top of that, we are picking up, because of the intervention, they have this additional boost in their GPA. So that's what we're trying to capture. And using the limited data that we have, trying to be creative about the methods that we can to really capture that causal influence.
Gong, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, I just would like to have a little bit follow up if you don't mind. Like I was also trying to comment your statement regarding the international students do not really get the, let's say, international competence because they can't actually have like strong relationship with the domestic students. I was trying to give a little comment because based on my my experience living in Australia and in the UK, like mostly the relationship that I had that could improve my global competence, for instance, are from other international students, not from domestic students. So some colleagues of mine as well mentioned the same thing, like they have difficulties to actually blend themselves with the domestic students. Like they most likely gain everything like broad networks and the student English capability and the like are from their relationship with other international students instead of the domestic students. Yeah, that was just my comment about this. And I hope in the future universities in the world, especially those who are developing their internationalization agenda, could somehow consider this kind of situation where they can actually try to pair international students with the local students. And this pairing is expected to somehow create environment for those international students to somehow not only blend with other international students, but also with the domestic students in the countries where they study.
Thank you for that input. That's actually a very important observation. I think in some campus setting, I've noticed that, especially for postgrad students or graduate students, some universities might put the international students in one accommodation location. So they will put all the students in this international housing building. So all of the international students will be located there. So that would create limited access to the local students and access as an access point to the local culture. I've seen some of those practices before. In this particular setting, I think it's unique in that the college really tries to break that, to blend in international students into the local student body. We also bear in mind that the context that we're working with is Appalachia. So Appalachia is historically being relatively more excluded as a place. So that might have an impact on the students. For example, coming into America and going into this particular region of the United States, they might have, for example, cultural misfits or all the other problems or issues arising during their stay in Berea campus. This is potentially one mechanism that can explain maybe there are positive effects throughout its interaction with their domestic peers. But because of this cultural misfit or wider environment going into this particular region in the United States and on this campus, these benefits are offset. So potentially, so these are some of the conjectures that we can come up with, but further research is needed. Please talk to the students qualitatively, ask them why, and let them tell you why. And if we have big enough of a record, then we can say something and establish a pattern.
Thanks, Hsin-Ta. And our next question is from Melissa Watley.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. The study is really interesting. And as you mentioned, incredibly useful for policy and practice as well. The implications are very applicable. My question is around how you tease apart international student status and academic performance in your study. So if I'm remembering correctly, at the beginning of the presentation, you showed that on average, international students have better academic performance than domestic students. So I'm curious, so for these positive effects that you see among the domestic students, is the positive effect because they're living with an international student, or is the positive effect because they're living with a student who performs better than they do academically? I could imagine a situation where a student also benefits from living with another domestic student if that other domestic student is perhaps more studious or better performing academically in some way. And it's not necessarily due to the actual international status that you're seeing this effect.
Right. That's a very fair question. I got asked that sometimes too in other presentations. Are we necessarily looking at international versus domestic, or are we just looking at a group of students who are high achieving and another group that's relatively lower achieving? To really answer that question, we would need prior to college data. So we would have to establish their ability somehow. Based on past research, other studies have done this by looking at, for example, their high school GPA, their high school study pattern, or some researchers call it study propensity, how studious they were in high school. Some other research also look at SAT scores, ACT scores, or college entrance examination scores in the United States for our international audience. So I don't have data for those. I don't have their pre-college data to really establish that ability will be a factor or not. So that's another limitation for our study because we don't have access to that data. One thing, however, if you look at our results for international subgroup, within the subgroup of the international students, the absence of the significant differences in roommate experiences between international students paired with a domestic student, domestic US student, and those paired with a different student, international student from another nationality, right? So those two within that subsample, it does help alleviate to some extent the concern of comparing US students with international students presumed to have higher academic abilities. If the international students in our subsample have inherently higher ability relative to the United States, presumably, we would expect to observe variation in the outcomes between that international student rooming with a US student and the other one, international student rooming with another international student from a different country. So we would pick up that variation, but we don't see that differentiation. So that is not evident, at least in the findings that we have. So I would say that concern is mitigated, but to a larger extent, we cannot measure that because we don't have ability variables prior to college.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you do have first term GPA, is that correct?
Yeah. First
so
year,
I do a lot.
year, not first term.
First year. Okay. All right. I do a lot of work in the community college environment, and this is a problem I run into in my work as well, is that community colleges often don't have prior academic achievement in their data sets because they're an open access institution. And I've often used first term GPA as a proxy for this prior
Right.
academic performance.
Right.
So, it might be worth digging into, well, what do you have that's from early on in students' enrollment, like that first year GPA? I wonder if comparing, so you've got this comparison between domestic students who have international roommates and international students who have domestic roommates. What about also looking at domestic students with domestic roommates and international students with international roommates? I wonder if there's some useful comparisons that you could make there that would help you address this question using the data that you do have.
Yeah, that might be a good extension. And thank you for that idea. I will look into those extension more, and I will talk to my co-author about it. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you both. I've got a further couple of questions, Hsin-Ta, about your work. Where do you take this inquiry next, and what else are you working on?
One of the things that we do see in pure effect studies is context does matter a lot. So for international students, for example, in the United States, we are looking at largely a group of students who are self-funded, as Professor pointed out earlier. So we're looking at a group of students who are relatively well off in their home country context, at least. So it's really difficult to really say that international students' influence on local students is because of academic influence, study influence, or socioeconomic differences. Would that be picked up and explained by the fact that these international students coming to the United States are, by and large, relatively more well off? And would that be a factor? So the next thing I would say to explore peer effects in higher education is to look at different types of institutions. So to look at institutions that are minority serving, for example, look into minority serving institutions or look into regular state universities instead of looking at the elite schools. Maybe the elite schools may have some sort of connections with the researchers that are studying this type of topic, so the data is easier to get. But if we look beyond that, what happened to other type of institutions, minority serving institutions, large state universities? Do we actually see the same thing? And what does that entail if we look at enough different contexts and school subgroups and the different environments, not just in the United States, but more broadly across the world, then we can see more patterns and we can have more evidence and more findings to add to the mix of discussion. And we can have a more meaningful and wider discussion about, this is what we see in this context, in this country, and this is what we see in this other context, in this other country. So that would be more meaningful, interesting, I think. What I'm doing next, I am still a doctoral student, so I don't know, I'm still exploring, but I am very interested in doing education policy related research topics that are related to marginalized communities. So for example, the LGBTQ community, the low income students, and also disability students. So that's the general direction. I'm still narrowing down my research focus and trying to survive in my doctoral program, if you may. Right.
Understood. And good you're working on disability because, there's so many students in that category and they perhaps of all the marginalised groups most neglected, I think, across the world. Really good to have learned about your work and to learn about this particular study. And I think everyone who was engaged in the webinar was very impressed by the way you presented it and what you presented. Hsin-Ta, so we'll look forward to seeing you again on the webinar program when you're ready to come back with some more data for us. I think we can, at this point, move to winding up. And let me remind everyone of what has just gone into the chat, that our next webinar, which will be in 1 week's time, will be on the state of the UK's global engagement, trends, opportunities and challenges. Quite a strong presentation, a research-based one as well. And we look forward to that discussion. So we move from the larger question of relations between international students and domestic students using US data to now looking at the global engagement of one particular country, the one that that holds the purse strings for our centres. So we do tend to give it some attention from time to time. Really good to work with you, Hsin-Ta, and good luck with all your work, and especially with your doctorate. Really hope you go well with the doctoral study. And thanks for everyone for tuning in, and don't forget to catch up with the repeats on YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you in 1 week's time when we talk about the UK's global engagement. So bye for now.
Thank you.